Hello everyone. Welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. In 2011, Stephen McGown's journey began like an ordinary vacation. He had come from South Africa to West Africa, specifically Mali, for a tourist trip. At the time, McGown was fascinated by the northern regions of Africa, especially the cultural richness of Mali. His group had set out to explore the region's tourist attractions and interact with the local people. What began as a simple journey would turn into much more than they could have imagined. McGown's life was peaceful and enjoyable, unaware of the impending danger. However, in September 2011, while traveling to the abandoned and dangerous areas of northern Mali, the group was suddenly attacked by Al-Qaeda militants. This region was known for its strong Al-Qaeda presence and frequent militant activities at the time. The tourist group was ambushed by armed militants, and without warning they were kidnapped. Most of the group was taken by Al-Qaeda militants, and McGown found himself among the captives. Amidst the guns and threats, the group was split up, with each person being handed over to different militant factions. McGown, along with other tourists, was isolated, and without the chance to connect with the rest of the group, he found himself facing both physical and psychological challenges. In a matter of minutes, his life had changed completely. He went from being a simple tourist to a man thrust into a humanitarian crisis. The moments when McGown was first captured were only the beginning of what would become a long ordeal. In the hands of his captors, in the remote and uncontrolled regions of the area, there was no chance of receiving help. McGown, along with the other captives, was deprived of basic needs for a long time. Each passing day became more uncertain and terrifying for him as he faced the unknown fate that awaited him. This would become one of McGown's toughest tests, a fight for survival that began without him even realizing it. While in the hands of Al-Qaeda, McGown and the others had no idea what their future held. They did not know where they would be taken, what kind of abuse awaited them, or how long they would be held. In the first days of captivity, McGown found himself cut off from the outside world, overwhelmed by fear, uncertainty, hunger, and thirst. The darkness of these first days was just a preview of the challenges that would come in the following years. McGown's survival instincts were his only response to the chaotic and deadly environment. Every day was uncertain, and he struggled to survive moment by moment. In those moments, freedom seemed like a luxury, and life itself felt like a gift. When McGown was imprisoned under Al-Qaeda's control, his life changed entirely. He was once just a tourist eager to explore, understand the local culture, and enjoy a holiday in Africa's rich nature. But from the moment he was kidnapped, everything turned upside down. His captivity would challenge him both physically and psychologically. The Al-Qaeda militants took McGown and the other captives to a heavily guarded area, where they were completely isolated from the outside world. At first, being deprived of his freedom made McGown realize how uncertain everything had become. After just a few days of captivity, he found himself in a desolate settlement surrounded by stone buildings covered with sand and enclosed by a fence. As the days passed, he began to realize that his freedom and normal life were becoming mere fantasies. Since his capture, he had no opportunity to communicate with anyone. Although he was imprisoned with others, forming any kind of close bond was impossible, as each person was held in separate cells and all communication was prohibited. This environment, McGown's only focus was on surviving. On one hand, he faced the constant fear of death, and on the other, he struggled with physical and psychological challenges. His food and water were extremely limited, especially during the early days of captivity. The Islamic militants rationed the provisions they provided, using scarcity as a strategy to push McGown and the other captives to their limits. The constant uncertainty made McGown's situation even more difficult. He had no idea how long he would remain in these conditions, or whether he would ever regain his freedom. In the early days, McGown began to realize just how much a person's physical and emotional limits could be pushed. The food, water, and hygiene conditions were terrible. His meager rations consisted of a few slices of bread and spoiled water, barely enough to survive. The Al-Qaeda militants also didn't hesitate to apply psychological pressure. They made every attempt to break his mental resilience. McGown was isolated, which only worsened his sense of loneliness. He was in a constant state of uncertainty, never knowing which actions were right, when to speak, or when to stay silent. As the days passed, he lost track of time. The months of darkness at night wore him down both physically and emotionally. At times, he searched for a glimmer of hope to escape the dark and oppressive environment he was trapped in. But that light always seemed distant, nothing more than a mere illusion. In those moments, the thought of freedom seemed so far away and impossible that he had to constantly motivate himself just to survive. For McGown, staying psychologically strong became a battle against his mental limits. However, these challenges gradually taught him a valuable lesson. He had to find a reason to keep going each day without losing his resilience. Every step forward kept him strong in the face of uncertainty. Every moment of captivity tested McGown's identity. To remain mentally strong meant, above all, not losing hope. Indeed, he was fighting not just a physical battle for survival, but a psychological one as well. Every day, a question constantly circled in his mind. When would he be free? But the answer to that question felt so distant. McGown's years of captivity were a process that pushed his limits not just physically, but mentally. At the beginning, McGown, held by Al-Qaeda, was tossed between many emotions. Sadness, fear, and helplessness were the most intense emotions he felt. These emotions gradually took root in his mind as his captivity began. Over time, however, these dark feelings gave way to something else. McGown realized that to survive, he had to maintain his mental toughness. In the early days of captivity, the emotional challenges McGown faced grew even deeper. No matter how resilient a person's psychology might be under great stress and uncertainty, it can eventually break. In the initial days after his abduction, everything felt chaotic. Armed militants constantly moved around him, and he had to live with the constant fear of death or abuse. But gradually, he tried to find a way to cope with these fears, or at least control them. If necessary, he had to create a world in his mind because the outside world had already vanished. The presence of Al-Qaeda in El Mali significantly affected McGown's mental state. The organization's members were not ordinary people. They were ideologically driven, harsh, and relentless. When McGown's freedom was taken, he tried to understand the behavior of those around him. Each came from a different background, but most had adopted violence as a means to pursue their goals, forcing others to follow their ideology. The Islamic militants treated McGown and the other captives harshly. For them, McGown and the others were mere tools. They had a mission to fulfill regardless of the personal suffering and challenges they faced. This goal was to stand against Western powers and add new victories to their ideological struggle. Each militant shared a similar lifestyle and mindset, so their solidarity was strong. They all served a similar purpose. Their determination to survive and complete their missions was a constant threat in McGown's mind. The psychological pressure the militants applied to McGown and the other captives was varied. Sudden movements, threats, terrifying speeches, and even threats of physical violence were all meant to break them. But the most effective tactic was psychological manipulation. McGown lived in constant fear, not only of losing his freedom, but also of losing his identity. This version captures the nuances of his psychological and physical struggles while maintaining clarity and depth. Placing pressure on a single person's identity for an extended period leads to mental deterioration, and McGown, at first, was vulnerable to this deterioration. The members of Al-Qaeda were not only holding McGown physically captive, but were also applying ideological pressure, attempting to shape him according to their views. However, McGown initially developed some resistance to these pressures. Although, in the dark and threatening environment, he began to see freedom as a mere illusion, he was still fighting to survive by holding on to something. To survive mentally, McGown focused on one goal every day: to live. Not only surviving physically but also staying mentally healthy, McGown made an effort to stick to a specific routine each day. When he woke up, the beginning of the day shaped his psychological load and what to expect. Every day, Every new moment brought him hope, but that hope always seemed distant and uncertain. During this process, McGown learned to embark on his inner journey mentally. To calm himself and continue surviving, he developed techniques to guide his thoughts. Although disconnected from the outside world, his search for inner balance gave him a sense of control in the chaotic world he found himself in. Another aspect of his mental struggle was McGown's isolation. It was nearly impossible for him to connect with the other captives in the same situation. In an environment where each person fought to survive with different strategies in their own inner world, McGown had no choice but to be alone. Loneliness, while triggering a psychological collapse on one hand, also began to transform into a source of strength. The inner battle he fought allowed him to survive and gain a form of mental flexibility. Could a light of hope one day appear? The answer to this question was always uncertain, but for McGown, each passing day meant taking one more step, becoming more resilient. The mental struggle became an existential question for him. How can a person endure between death and suffering? Although McGown didn't find the answer to this question, with each passing day, he continued to recover and step by step kept searching for the answer in every moment. Not just as a person, but as an example of survival, he was determined to push his boundaries. Stephen McGown's abduction was a huge trauma and shock for his family. His family in South Africa had their world turned upside down with the first news of their son's disappearance. McGown's family experienced one of the most terrifying moments of their lives in an unexpected way. On one hand, there was the pain of losing their child, and on the other, there was the uncertainty of how to make sense of this pain. For them, a missing person was not just a loss, but also an uncertainty. Whether their son would ever return, whether he was alive or dead, could never be clearly known. At first, McGown's family struggled to believe the situation. Family members tried to understand what had happened to their son and why he had been kidnapped. However, as time passed, they realized how complex and dangerous everything was. McGown's abduction created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that surrounded not only him but also his entire family, friends, and loved ones. With each passing day, the news of his disappearance spread, and the world began to follow the story of McGown, the missing Western tourist. Governments and international organizations started to get involved, but the process was complex and challenging. The South African government initiated efforts through various diplomatic channels to secure McGown's release. Although many countries were cautious about negotiating with such terrorist groups, the fight for McGown's life and freedom continued. Meanwhile, international rescue operations and crisis management experts were working on various strategies to figure out how to reach an agreement with Al-Qaeda. However, everything was proceeding amidst great uncertainty. Governments had to consider every possible risk in negotiations with Al-Qaeda militants. Over time, McGown's family, alongside the official rescue efforts, put in significant personal effort as well. Many family members, friends, and supporters launched various campaigns to find McGown and secure his release. The family made numerous public relations efforts to attract both local and international media attention. The fear and uncertainty everyone was facing forced them to come together in the struggle. McGown's mother, father, and siblings turned every day into a search effort, looking for any clue about the life of their son or brother. During this process, the family's unity and the support they gave each other were among the most important factors keeping McGown's hope of regaining his freedom alive. Nevertheless, McGown's family were not just relatives of a missing man, but also individuals trying to cope with the limited resources offered to them by the system and society. Family members had to push their own psychological boundaries, oscillating between great hope and fear every day. No matter how much help they sought, their resources were limited, and finding a person lost in the dark world of Al-Qaeda was no easy task. With each passing day, McGown's family questioned how much they could fight to bring their child back, but each difficulty kept them together. The struggle became a bond that held them together. Although McGown could not physically feel the support of his family and loved ones, he began to sense its effects in their minds and hearts. Years after his abduction, the strong bond his family created for him helped McGown survive. His family frequently sent him hopeful messages and continued to fight for his release in every possible way. This reinforced his mental resilience and became a part of his struggle to survive during his years of captivity. Communication, though not direct, continued in indirect ways. His family made sure he felt that they had not forgotten him, always thinking of him and waiting for him, praying for his return. Feeling his family's support further boosted McGown's inner strength to survive. Every day thinking of their love and support, he continued to fight. Their love for him was like a light that never faded, guiding him. Even though he often felt mentally alone, the presence of his family and loved ones always provided him with a light of hope. Drawing inspiration from his family's strength, McGown continued to face the hardships of captivity. Mentally, he was striving to survive with the power his family bonds provided him every day. Ultimately, the path to McGown's freedom was opened by the support of his family and loved ones. The diplomatic efforts of governments and the involvement of international organizations were important, but McGown's family's patience, love, and determination constantly gave him more strength. His fight was not just for his own life, but for survival, fueled by the power of his family's love and devotion. After 6 years of arduous captivity, the moment McGown regained his freedom became an incredible beacon of hope, not only for himself, but also for millions of people around the world. When he was kidnapped by Al-Qaeda in 2011, McGown's family and loved ones never gave up on imagining that he would one day return, no matter how difficult it was. However, years of uncertainty made hope harder with each passing day. McGown's release process was shaped by the significant efforts of his family and the international community. McGown's release was not just about one person regaining freedom. It was also a turning point for global diplomacy and the fight against terrorism. Negotiating with terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda was known to be a highly sensitive issue, carrying significant risks and sometimes leading to harsh political reactions worldwide. However, the resolute stance of McGown's family and governments eventually brought the tough negotiations to a point where they could change the outcome. The release process was the fruit of long and difficult diplomatic efforts. McGown's family, especially in cooperation with the South African government, continued to play a significant role in the negotiations with Al-Qaeda. Governments had to take numerous difficult diplomatic steps to ensure McGown's release. During this process, international organizations and states engaged in constant negotiations and bargaining to understand Al-Qaeda's demands and wishes. However, above all, ensuring McGown's safe rescue was a matter of security. These 6 years of negotiations were an intense and critical process from start to finish. Although Al-Qaeda was a global terrorist organization, it operated according to a specific strategy. McGown's release had become an opportunity for the group to broadcast its political messages worldwide. However, the negotiations for McGown's release also highlighted how complex and multifaceted the fight against terrorism is. The delicate balance in foreign policy, local political interests, and humanitarian interventions were all trying to work together. Despite all these challenges, his family continued to wait every day with new hopes, seeking a semblance of peace. Each new development nourished their hopes, yet at the same time increased their fears. Because although the entire world wanted McGown's release, the outcome of negotiations with an organization like Al-Qaeda was never guaranteed. Even though McGown's family deeply felt the pain of losing their son with each passing day, they always carried the hope of his release. Finally, in 2017, the long-awaited moment for McGown's freedom arrived. After 6 years of captivity, an agreement between Al-Qaeda and its allies led to McGown's release. This moment became a source of immense joy and relief for both his family and the world. McGown experienced the moment his family had been waiting for so long. That moment became a symbol of survival, human resistance against all odds, and rebirth through the love of his family. Immediately after his release, when McGown embraced his family, the emotional weight of the moment felt like a victory that touched the entire world. McGown's mother, father, and siblings, after the dark day when their son disappeared, finally experienced the indescribable happiness of holding their loved one again. That moment allowed the whole family to leave some of the past pains behind. When McGown was released, his condition was not just one of liberation. It was also the reconstruction of a person who had been mentally and physically broken. The tough times he endured over 6 years had not only worn down his body but also his soul. However, when he regained his freedom, he found the strength to embrace life once again. McGown's release was not only the result of his personal struggle, it was also a symbol of a global victory, the fight for human rights and survival. For his family, it was a victory of love and determination. Each day, each hour, every moment spent in uncertainty had strengthened the spirit of McGown's family. And finally, the return of a son, a brother, gave hope to the whole world. McGown's release was a victory for humanity because no matter how great the challenges, love, hope, and determination can always prevail. After Stephen McGown's release, his life underwent profound psychological changes, not just physical ones. 6 years of captivity had left marks on both his body and his soul. However, the end of his captivity marked the beginning of a healing process, even though he had regained his freedom. After being freed, McGown began to realize how these experiences had made him a stronger and more resilient person, while also attempting to cope with the trauma of the past. At first, it was not easy for McGown to return to a normal life. Years of captivity had not only physically but also mentally destroyed him. For 6 years, he had struggled to survive under inhumane conditions, and the cost of this struggle had not only made him question his life, but also his identity. His eyes had been buried in a prison far from the outside world. People and sounds had gradually faded, becoming like a dream. He had constantly felt isolated and alone. However, when he was released, trying to reconnect with the world brought great emotional and physical strain. When McGown was first released, he made efforts to escape emotional collapse. Mentally, it would take time to fully recover from the effects of long-term captivity. The years spent in constant fear, anxiety, uncertainty, and loneliness had deeply affected his emotional state. However, over time, accepting the trauma he had experienced was the first step in his healing process. Instead of seeing himself as a victim, he began to view this experience as a part of his survival struggle. This shift in thinking was an important step in McGown's journey toward becoming a stronger person. He realized that survival is not only a physical effort, but a mental one as well. His captivity had tested his resilience, not only physically but also mentally. The desire to survive and the love of family were the most important forces that kept McGown going. At the end of his captivity, as he looked back at his life and the world, he became an example of just how strong a person can be. He showed everyone how an ordinary person could survive under extraordinary circumstances and how, even in the worst conditions, one could manage to hold on to hope. McGown's life after his release symbolized, in a sense, his rebirth. He began to rebuild himself both physically and mentally. Mental health became just as important to him as survival. Professional therapy, family support, and his gradually maturing inner strength all helped him on his road to recovery. Many people asked how McGown overcame the trauma he experienced and how he managed to hold on to life. These questions led him to transform his experiences into a tool that would inspire others. McGown decided to turn the challenges he faced, not just for himself, but into an experience that could benefit others. His struggle during captivity and his will to survive became a source of hope for others. He participated in conferences, gave speeches on television and radio programs, and wrote articles. As he shared his story, he inspired others. McGown emphasized that survival was not just a physical effort, but also about how powerful the human spirit and mind could be. Many people began to use McGown's trauma, fears, and struggles as a guide to fight the obstacles they encountered in their own lives. After his release, the messages McGown shared focused particularly on the importance of psychological resilience and mental strength. He wasn't just telling a kidnapping story. He was providing guidance on how individuals could cope with the challenges they face in their own lives. The way McGown continued his life became an example to others, not just of survival, but also of the strength to live for a purpose. He had not only regained his physical freedom but had also found his inner freedom. After accepting himself and the pain he had endured, using these experiences as a tool to help others made him even stronger. The pains of captivity led him to a deeper understanding and an increased desire to help others. In this way, he truly found his freedom. In conclusion, McGown's journey after his release was not just a survival story, but also a symbol of a person's ability to rise above challenges, hold on to life, and inspire others. Every step and every hardship gave him not only his own strength, but also the power to help others. McGown was no longer just a symbol of survival. He had become a person who represented the power of finding hope and surviving even in the face of adversity.